Hong Kong, 1972. The air in the abandoned warehouse smelled of dust and forgotten machinery. Sunlight cut through the high windows in sharp angles, illuminating nothing but emptiness and the faint outlines of two men standing in the center of the concrete floor. No cameras, no crew, no audience except for a handful of witnesses who would carry this moment quietly for the rest of their lives. This was not a movie set. This was not choreography. This was the space where reputation goes to be tested. Bruce Lee stood with his hands loose at his sides, his breathing so calm it seemed as though his body had no need for oxygen. He wore plain clothes, a dark shirt, simple pants, nothing that suggested performance, nothing that suggested anything other than a man standing exactly where he belonged. His eyes were not focused on his opponent. They were focused on everything. The distance, the air, the tension coiling in the space between intention and action. He had been here before, not in this warehouse, but in this moment. The moment when doubt meets certainty and only one survives. Across from him stood a man whose name has been lost to time, but whose presence that day was unmistakable. A traditional martial artist, a practitioner of a style so old it carried the weight of dynasties. He was taller than Bruce Lee, heavier. His posture was rigid, formal, locked into the shapes his teachers had drilled into him since childhood. His arms were positioned in the classical guard, elbows tight, fists chambered, stance wide and rooted. He looked like a statue carved from certainty, and in his eyes was something sharper than anger. Contempt. He had come here because he had heard the rumors. Bruce Lee, the movie star, the man who had taken martial arts and turned it into entertainment, who had stripped away tradition and replaced it with what he called philosophy, but what this man knew was just arrogance. Bruce Lee had become famous not by honoring the old ways, but by rejecting them, by claiming that the forms passed down through generations were useless, that real combat had nothing to do with ceremony. And to this man, that was not innovation. It was betrayal. "You are not a real fighter," he said, his voice echoing flatly in the empty warehouse. "You are an actor, a dancer. You move for cameras, not for truth." Bruce Lee did not respond. His expression did not change. He simply looked at the man, not with hostility, but with something closer to patience. He had heard these words before, from masters who believed that tradition was truth, from fighters who could not separate the ritual from the reality, from men who had spent decades perfecting techniques that worked beautifully in theory and collapsed the moment chaos entered the equation. He did not blame them. He understood them. But understanding did not mean agreement. The man continued, his voice rising with conviction. "You think you can abandon the foundation and still stand. You think speed and tricks are enough. But when you face someone who has trained in the true way, you will break. Because you have no root, no discipline, no respect." Bruce Lee exhaled slowly. When he spoke, his voice was low, almost gentle, but it carried a weight that made the air feel heavier. "You believe that because you have memorized the forms, you understand the fight. But forms are not fighting. They are maps. And a map is not the territory." The man's jaw tightened. His hands clenched into fists. "Then prove it. Prove that your way is anything more than performance." Bruce Lee nodded once. Not in eagerness. Not in aggression. Just acknowledgement. The kind of nod that says, if you need to see it, then you will see it. The witnesses around the edge of the warehouse shifted slightly, their breathing shallow. They knew what was about to happen, or they thought they did. But knowing and seeing are not the same thing. The traditional fighter moved first. He launched forward with a straight punch, textbook perfect, his rear fist driving from his hip in a line so precise it could have been drawn with a ruler. His front foot slid forward, his back leg pushing off with all the force his training had built into it. It was fast, clean, exactly as it had been taught for centuries. And it missed. Bruce Lee was no longer there. He had not blocked. He had not parried. He had simply shifted, his body dissolving out of the path of the punch as though the space he occupied was optional. And before the man's arm had fully extended, Bruce Lee's lead hand snapped forward, the edge of his palm stopping a fraction of an inch from the man's throat. Time collapsed. The strike had taken less than a second. No wind-up. No preparation. No indication that it was coming until it had already arrived. The traditional fighter froze, his eyes wide, his breath caught somewhere between his lungs and his mouth. Bruce Lee's hand hovered there, steady, controlled, the message clear. If this had been real, it would have been over. Bruce Lee withdrew his hand and stepped back, his posture returning to that same relaxed neutrality, as though nothing had happened. But everything had happened. The man stood there, his perfect form suddenly feeling like a cage, his certainty crumbling into something he could not name. He had been fast. He had been precise. And none of it had mattered. Again, the man said, his voice tight. That was luck. Bruce Lee said nothing. He simply reset. The man attacked again. This time a different technique. A low kick aimed at Bruce Lee's lead leg, followed by a reverse punch to the midsection. Two movements chained together, textbook combination, designed to break rhythm and exploit openings. And again, Bruce Lee was not there. He slipped the kick with a subtle weight shift, his hips turning just enough to make the strike pass through empty air, and his counter came before the man's punch had even begun. A back fist, lightning quick, stopping a hair's width from the temple. The man stumbled back, not from impact, but from realization. His breathing was uneven now, his confidence leaking out with every exhale. He tried a third time, a grab, attempting to close the distance, to trap Bruce Lee in close range where size and strength could dominate. His hands reached forward, fast and committed, and Bruce Lee moved through them like smoke, redirecting the grab with a flick of his wrist and placing his fingertips against the man's solar plexus with surgical precision. 3 exchanges, 8 seconds, 3 opportunities to prove that tradition could stand against adaptation. And 3 times, Bruce Lee had dismantled the attack before it could even form. The man stepped back, his chest heaving, his hands dropping slowly to his sides. The fight was over, not because he had been hurt. He had not been touched, but because he had been shown something that his years of training had not prepared him for. He had been shown that the distance between thinking and acting was the only distance that mattered, and Bruce Lee had eliminated it. One of the witnesses, an older martial artist who had studied under some of the same masters as the challenger, stepped forward. His face was pale. How? He asked quietly. How is it possible? Bruce Lee turned to him, his expression calm, almost serene. You trained to perform the technique correctly. I trained to remove everything between the decision and the result. You practiced the movement. I practiced the absence of hesitation. The traditional fighter looked down at his hands, those hands that had executed 10,000 punches, 10,000 blocks, 10,000 forms. Perfect hands. Trained hands. And yet, in this space, they had been too slow. Not because they lacked speed, but because they carried too much. Too much preparation. Too much ritual. Too much distance between the thought and the act. Bruce Lee continued, his voice carrying the tone of someone who was not lecturing, but simply translating what he had learned. You were taught that strength comes from structure. And structure does provide strength, but it also provides predictability. Every movement you make announces itself before it arrives. Your body has to shift into position. Your weight has to transfer according to form. Your technique has to complete its shape. And in those fractions of a second, you are readable. The man finally looked up, his eyes no longer filled with contempt, but with something raw, confusion, maybe even fear, not of Bruce Lee, but of the realization that everything he had believed was incomplete. Then what is the answer? He asked. Bruce Lee did not smile. He did not gloat. He simply said, the answer is not a technique. It is a state. You must become so attuned to the moment that your response is not separate from the attack. There is no gap, no decision tree, no mental checklist. The opponent moves, and you are already responding. Not because you are faster, but because you are present. The witnesses stood in silence. They had come expecting a fight. What they had seen was a lesson. A dismantling not of a man, but of an ideology. The belief that mastery was about perfecting the old ways. The belief that tradition was inherently superior to innovation. Bruce Lee had not disrespected tradition. He had transcended it. He had taken what was useful, discarded what was not, and built something that existed beyond style, beyond form, beyond the limitations that most fighters never even realized they were carrying. The traditional fighter bowed, not in defeat, but in acknowledgement. He had come to prove that Bruce Lee was nothing more than a performer, and he had left understanding that performance and reality are not opposites. That the man who moves on screen with precision is not pretending. He is demonstrating what he has already mastered in spaces like this. Spaces where there are no second takes, no stunt coordinators, no safety, just the raw, undeniable truth of what works and what does not. Bruce Lee returned the bow, his respect genuine. He had never wanted to humiliate this man. He had only wanted to show him what was possible when you stopped clinging to what you were taught and started discovering what was true. And truth, Bruce Lee had learned long ago, does not care about tradition. It only cares about what survives contact with reality. The warehouse emptied slowly. The witnesses left one by one, each of them carrying a story they would tell in whispers, in private conversations, in moments when someone else claimed to know what real fighting looked like. They would say, "I saw him once. Not on film. In person. And it was not like the movies. It was quieter, faster, more precise, and more terrifying." Bruce Lee remained for a moment longer, standing alone in the center of the concrete floor, the sunlight still cutting through the windows in those same sharp angles. He was not thinking about victory. He was already thinking about refinement, about the next layer, the next illusion to strip away. Because for him, there was no finish line, only deeper truth. The world would continue to call him a film fighter, a showman, an actor who had learned to move well for the camera. And he would let them, because those who needed to understand already did. And those who did not would continue to believe that what they saw on screen was exaggeration, never realizing that the truth was the opposite, that what he showed in films was the restrained version, the version softened for an audience that could not handle the real speed, the real precision, the real absence of wasted motion. But in places like this, in moments witnessed by only a few, the restraint disappeared. And what remained was not a performance. It was a principle made flesh. The principle that combat is not about strength or tradition or even skill. It is about the elimination of everything that stands between stimulus and response. It is about becoming so refined that action is no longer separate from awareness, that the fight is over before the opponent realizes it has begun. The man who challenged him that day never spoke publicly about what happened. He returned to his training, but something had changed. He began to question, to experiment, to ask whether the forms he had perfected were truly preparing him for reality or simply preparing him to perform the forms. And in that questioning, Bruce Lee's real victory emerged, not in domination, but in transformation, because that is what happens when certainty meets truth. Certainty can defend itself with words, with history, with tradition. But truth does not argue. It simply shows itself. And once seen, it cannot be unseen. Years later, stories would circulate. Whispers of private challenges, of moments when Bruce Lee faced real fighters, real skeptics, real masters who believed he was nothing more than Hollywood illusion. And in every story, the outcome was the same. Not because Bruce Lee was unbeatable, but because he had removed the barriers that make most fighters slow. He had eliminated hesitation, eliminated excess, eliminated the distance between thought and action. And in doing so, he had become something that traditional training could not account for. The lesson was never about Bruce Lee being superior. It was about the realization that mastery is not preservation. It is evolution. That the highest respect for tradition is not to repeat it endlessly, but to understand it so deeply that you can see where it succeeds and where it fails. And then to build something new from that understanding. The warehouse stands empty now. The witnesses have grown old, and some have passed. But the moment remains, frozen in the memory of those who were there. A reminder that the loudest voices are not always the truest, that the most celebrated techniques are not always the most effective, and that sometimes the greatest fighters are the ones the world calls actors, because they have learned to express truth so precisely that it looks like art. 8 seconds. That is all it took. Not to defeat a man, but to dismantle a belief. And belief, once broken, cannot be rebuilt the same way twice.